Hello and most welcome to 1637b. We will continue where I left off in 1637a. And I was just saying the other fear was that it introduces a new and unpredictable power, the soul. We shall consider the first point shortly, but the second is a philosophical misapprehension. As this book has tried to show, talk of the inner involves very different types of concepts, from the simple concepts which tend to dominate philosophical thinking, but it does not involve invoking any mysterious forces or ghostly entities. Having made this point, we still have to consider the claim that, like everything else, there must be a causal explanation of the abilities of the mind, and that this explanation must focus on the brain. The force of this claim results from the past success of science, and it expresses the basic scientific approach to the world. For central to that approach is the assumption that all phenomena, no matter how baffling they appear, are ultimately explicable in scientific terms. However, this assumption is a postulate. What it reflects is a particular attitude, more specifically, a commitment to look for causal laws even where none are apparent. Since we apply this principle elsewhere, it seems natural to apply it to the mind. And the only plausible way of doing so is to seek to explain the mind in terms of the brain. To object would seem not just narrow-minded, but biased. For why, one might ask, should we suddenly set limits to causality just because the object of investigation happens to be ourselves? The Wittgensteinian response to this challenge is to begin by underlining the assumption on which it is based. The idea that everything must have a causal explanation is not a sempiternal truth. It is a postulate reflecting a commitment to look for causes even in the face of apparent defeat. Clearly, if we want to explain and manipulate the world, this attitude is appropriate, and it has certainly proved astonishingly fruitful. However, the possibility of continuing the search indefinitely does not guarantee that everything will indeed one day be explained. On the contrary, if one were to make any general prediction, it would surely have to be that even on the most optimistic basis, success is unlikely to be 100%. In fact, the success of science has been so great that we take it for granted that everything must be predictable, even if it happens. We haven't the slightest idea how this might be done. In part, this conviction reflects an uneven diet of examples. For certain types of case dominate our thinking, That is the classic case of one billiard ball hitting another. As Wittgenstein points out, however, there are other types of case, and it is salutary to remember that science might have been far less successful than it has been. Had the case always been that of the apple tree with the leaves dancing about, don't you think we should have had a different idea? As things are now, you might say, if only we knew the velocity of the wind, the elasticity of the leaves, etc., then we could forecast the movement of the leaves. But we would never dream of saying this if we hadn't already been successful and colossally so. The success of science encourages us to assume that there is an explanation for everything, that the whole world is a pattern of causes we shall one day track down. But why must this be true? What justifies us in claiming that in every case where we currently don't have an explanation, one will eventually be discovered? The general argument that there must be causal explanations is reinforced with respect to the mind by the progress in understanding the brain that has actually been achieved this century. But here again, a handful of examples blinds us to the wider picture, for what we can explain is tiny in comparison with what we cannot. Thus, it is misleading to say everything points to the mind being explicable in terms of the brain. In fact, everything you notice when and where you look points to it, no more. One might also note that the form of the brain itself encourages us to suppose that there are explanations there waiting to be discovered. As Wittgenstein notes, the brain looks like a writing, inviting us to read it. Yet and yes, it is not a writing. Here it is interesting to note how easily superstition can influence our approach. For example, despite the evidence to the contrary, there's a strong temptation to claim that a larger brain must mean greater intelligence, or at least potentially greater intelligence. If, however, the sheer size of the brain is not correlated with its abilities, why are we so sure other more sophisticated correlations work? Furthermore, even if brain size and mental ability were correlated, it is conceivable that no further correlations might be obtainable. Wittgenstein illustrates this point by considering an apparently absurd example. Suppose humans became more intelligent the more books they owned. Suppose that were a fact, but it didn't matter what the books contained. The point of this example is that were it the case, there would be an almost irresistible inclination to say that what's in the books must matter. Ex hypothesi, this would be wrong. Similarly, although we may have a strong inclination to believe that investigation of the brain will ultimately yield causal explanation of all mental activity. It is quite conceivable that one day we should conclude that this is quite simply not the case. As we have seen, the claim that the mind must be explicable in terms of the brain is misguided. To what extent mental activities can be correlated with brain activity is an empirical matter, and not one which can be decided on purely conceptual grounds. This implies that assessing the claim is a question of plausibility. What is interesting, however, is that once one drops the assumption that the mind must be reducible to the brain, the whole idea suddenly seems extremely implausible. The sciences investigating the brain are, of course, quite right to assume that there is more to be discovered, and more certainly will be, but whether explanation will one day be total is a different matter. Consider the example of thought. If we treat thinking as the occurrence of a particular inner event, it may seem plausible that this will one day be correlated with a change in the brain. As we have seen, however, our concept of thinking does not function like that. To say that an individual had a thought does not imply that anything particular happened within her. It may sometimes mean she said something to herself, sometimes not. It may involve an image, or it may not. Furthermore, the intentionality of thought makes it hard to see how any correlation with brain states would be possible. The difficulty here is that the notion of one thought is a highly artificial concept. How many thoughts are there in the Tractatus? And when the basic idea for it struck Wittgenstein was that one thought, or a rash of them, the notion of intention creates similar problems. If someone says, "I intend to go to the bank," we can ask her which bank she means, and she may specify a particular bank, or say she is ready to go to any bank but Barclays, or that she isn't sure, but she knows she only have 10 minutes to look for one. These subsequent statements can all be seen as amplifications or explanations of the original thought. But how are we supposed to relate to the brain state? Are we to imagine that it too will somehow contain the answer to every possible question about the thought. This does not seem to make sense. And yet, if the state does not, we would have to allow that two significantly different thoughts might be correlated with the same brain state. And so we would have conceded the original sense issue. A similar difficulty arises from the nature of language. For as we saw in chapter 4, words may in one sense be interchangeable and in another sense not. This creates problems for the attempt to correlate brain states and thoughts, because it underlines the haziness of the concept of identity in relation to the latter. Two thoughts may be the same in one sense and different in another. For example, the statements "she is a fool" and "she is an idiot" might, roughly speaking, be said to express the same thought. On the other hand, each has a different tie-up with the rest of language, and as such can be used to express a unique nuance of meaning. So how should this be translated into brain states? How is the brain state to reflect the fact that the thought is both the same and not the same? The difficulty here is that the criteria of identity for thoughts, what counts as one thought as opposed to another, or as opposed to several, are not rigidly defined, for it is not often an issue, and where it is, what is at issue, and hence the appropriate criteria may vary. Thus, the notion of one thought is a fragile and artificial one, and for that reason it is hard to see what sense it could make to talk of a one-to-one correlation with brain states. The case of memory can also be used to undermine the claim that every aspect of the mind must be explicable in terms of the brain. The idea that there must be something in the brain which corresponds to the memory seems overwhelming, but this Wittgenstein denies. An event leaves a trace in the memory. One sometimes imagines this as if it consisted in the events having left a trace, an impression, a consequence in the nervous system. As if one could say, even the nerves have a memory. But then when someone remembered an event, he would have to infer it from this impression, this trace, whatever the event does leave behind in the organism. It isn't the memory. That's just fantastic. This is just getting better and better. 1637b. Why, thank you very much. We'll do a summary next time. A little overlook. It's getting more and more dense at the very end. More interesting, even more interesting if that's possible. And I think I get to the conclusion that memory is not sort of chiseled representations of happenings. That doesn't make any sense at all, I would say. Memory is a stamp of something that happened. No chance. There are no traces of former happenings somewhere in a storage room inside of the archives of the brain. There's no chance on earth it works that way. And I think that is hard to see through, even harder today compared to when the book was written in 1993. Today we are absolutely infused with memory as engravings like a CD or a computer disk. It's in our language, and it's so much easier to fall into this deceitful trap of memory as being sort of photographs of what went on before. I think maybe the modern memory idea is the most difficult thing to handle and the most disastrous if it's not handled correctly. But wait, it can also be the most fruitful business, because I think we can remember everything once we really understand that memory is not a recording, a copy, or an inner reflection of things past. A memory includes everything in this world. Outsideness, all the relations that are here in this world are a memory. They build up something much stronger than an engraving in the part of the brain. But more about that next time. Thank you very much and have a very pleasant day or night.